Well, yeah, I'm excited to be here today. Thanks so much to the Mercury team for bringing me in. We at CRV are proud to have been backing founders like Imad from Mercury for the past 54 years in the business. One of the longest tenured funds in the Valley at this point, founded in originally 1970, currently on our 19th fund, which is $1 billion fund. We focus primarily on seed and Series A investing, but we're proud to follow on in our companies as they continue to grow to the tune of several tens of millions of dollars. Other companies besides Mercury that you may know of that we work with, folks like Vercel, DoorDash, Airtable, Cribble, Postman, Kong, all from the seed or Series A stage. So pretty impressive track record. Not that I have much to do with it, but excited to be part of the team today. I've been on board at CRV for the past 4 years. Previously, I did my MBA at Wharton, and prior to that, began my career in consulting for Deloitte and did a stint at Uber on the operations side of things. I work with a number of companies in the portfolio, primarily on the infrastructure side of the house. So think data infrastructure, developer tooling, DevOps, security, all of those types of hard to build companies. But I've also worked with folks on the applied or SaaS side of things as well. So kind of have the holistic perspective across the B2B landscape. In terms of the agenda for today, so the theme of the session is really how to navigate the growth challenges that founders experience when going from the seed to the Series A. And I think the three relevant areas to touch upon here are really around talent, go-to-market, and fundraising, since those are usually the three kind of key obstacles that folks run into when they're making that transition. To start on the team side of things, so the number one thing to do when you're getting started building out the team beyond the first couple folks that you have on board, maybe you have a co-founder, maybe you have a founding engineer or two, and then it's time to start to look at your team and say, what are the really key gaps in terms of capabilities that we need to bring on board to enable us to continue to grow this product? And obviously, there's going to be a lot of variability there from company to company. So, for example, on the application side of things, you might continue to bring on some engineers, but then you might want to lean into a salesperson. For a more developer-led company on the infrastructure side of the house, you might want to lean more into DevRel because it's a different specific motion. And then for all of these companies, you might have very specific even engineering competencies that you want to bring on board. So, for example, front end versus back end, distributed systems, all sorts of different flavors of engineering that you might need to help you build the product. And so I think being really thoughtful about what are those gaps that are going to move the needle for you in the initial stages of getting the product off the ground is a really important thing to just spend some time on and be thoughtful about, because the last thing you want to do is wind up bringing on board 2, 3, 4 copies of kind of the same person that don't do much to really multiply the capabilities on the team. When you're doing that, the other thing to be really thoughtful about is where exactly you are sourcing these people from. And so I'll say time and time again, the number one best referral source we see for high quality candidates is from the founder's own networks. When we're doing seed investments, it's actually something that we key in on a lot. If the co-founders have kind of a bench of the next 3, 4, 5 folks who they're thinking of bringing on board, and if those folks kind of come from the previous experience that the founders have at their prior companies. The reason for this is because, one, hiring is really, really hard, right? Convincing somebody to join your early stage startup is no mean feat, especially when you're competing against the compensation offers they might get from Fang, they might get from OpenAI. It's very competitive out there. And so anything that's going to give you an edge in being able to win over those candidates is really important to lean into. And pulling from your personal network is one area that allows you to kind of have that edge from a peer relationship perspective. And so when we're evaluating founders, we like to see that they have that to bring to the table, because we know that it's going to be a real accelerant for the business, that rather than spending cycles, sifting through kind of the landscape of who's available to hire, they already can go to those targeted 2, 3, 4 people and get them on board more quickly. The other point is that when you hire from your network, you have a lot longer period of time over which you've had the opportunity to evaluate somebody's abilities. And so you just have a better set of information versus going off of, what they have on LinkedIn, a few questions from the interview panel, and a few references. I mean, all of those things are necessary to do once you hit a certain level of scale. But earlier on, the more perfect information you can have around how good someone really is, the better. And the best way to get that information is to be able to gather it over a much longer period of time. If you as a founder don't have necessarily the biggest pool of people to pull from, the best thing you can do besides that is go to what I call the N+1 referrals. So friends of friends who can also kind of testify to the abilities of folks who you're looking at building on board, ideally who've worked with those folks for a long time, who have that same kind of like level of context, and importantly, whose judgment you trust, because you're only as good as their judgment if you're going to rely upon that kind of secondhand recommendation. Related to that, it's really important to have a high bar and to know what good looks like. And so depending on your previous experience, if you've worked at a very high growth, high potential company previously, you may have a little bit of that innately because you've just been around the block. You've kind of seen what people inside of these amazing companies look like. You kind of know how to evaluate them, particularly if they're in your personal zone of genius. If you're a technical founder, you probably know how to evaluate other technical founders better than you know how to evaluate a prospective sales hire, for example. And so particularly if you're going outside of your comfort zone, it's very important to be able to develop that taste around what does good look like for this specific role. And one of the ways that we help founders do that is we say, here are our top 5 sales candidates from within our network. They've all worked at these very important companies. They were there at a similar stage in the journey. You probably can't hire them today. They're probably really tough to get, but they will be good examples to look at to say okay, next time I'm interviewing my prospective sales candidate, do they match up to this person? How would I rank them? What competencies do they seem to have? What do they not seem to have? And it just gives you a better sense of what you should be indexing on. The other way to hack this is to lean on other folks in your network who can evaluate this type of talent. So if you know folks who are much more competent on the sales side of things, for example, you can actually ask them to interview people on your behalf and use their heuristics as kind of your outsourced benchmark. Again, it's a little bit dependent upon how much you trust the judgment of those people. You're putting a lot of trust in a secondhand referral in that instance. So it's better to do it yourself if you can build the capability and muscle to do it over time. But there's certainly no shame into reaching into your network in a world where it really helps you keep that bar very high. I do think that the conventional wisdom around, A players hire A players, and then there's kind of a degrading effect on the talent base if you bring in B players, C players, so on. I think that we've seen that to be true in examples that we have encountered. And so I would strongly, strongly recommend not making that sacrifice early on quality and instead being willing to move at a little bit of a slower pace than you might otherwise want to if it means keeping that bar really high. And that's related to the last point, which is hire slowly, fire quickly. So again, I think that it makes a lot of sense early on that you really want to get going. You feel the pressure. You want to move, build quickly. But making hiring mistakes can be pretty costly if you rush into things, especially if it's a core member of a very small team early on. They're taking on a lot of responsibility, a lot of work, and they meaningfully shift the culture of the company in a much more real way than if they're the 10th, 15th, 20th hire. And so the last thing you want to do is to rush into something just because you're feeling the pressure and then wind up, realizing 6 months after the fact that it was a bad decision and you go back to the drawing board. Meanwhile, your company is off an entirely different direction. People are feeling demoralized by the experience they've had with this person. It just creates a lot of bad vibes all around. So I would recommend really front loading the time and effort that you spend with candidates. And then, in the world where you make mistakes, which of course will happen from time to time, trying to recognize that as quickly as possible and not feeling the need to give the person, one more chance. Like at the end of the day, you're probably better off cutting bait. If it's not a hell yes, it's a no in a lot of instances. Okay, so now you have your team together. You've been building the product, and it seems to be resonating pretty well with the early folks that you're talking to. When you're having those conversations, one of the most important things you can do is try to narrow down the universe of potential customers that you're considering. And this is what we call the ideal customer profile, or ICP. This is something that we as VCs index on super heavily. Do you have a sense of who exactly your product is for and why it's resonating with them? There are some companies that early on can say, oh, well, we're for everyone. I would say that is by and large the exception versus the rule. For most folks today that we speak with, it does make sense to have a much narrower view of the universe and be very focused in terms of who exactly it is you're targeting. Just because when you're a seed stage startup, you're very resource constrained. And so the more effort you can dedicate in one direction, the faster you'll be able to run in that direction. And so I recommend, early on doing a bunch of interviews across a bunch of different areas to try to figure that out. But once you think you have an idea, spend some time really gunning in that one direction and see how far you can get with it and see if you can reach something resembling product market fit. Related to that point, it's very important early on, I think, for founders to be the ones having these conversations and doing the selling. I know particularly for technical founders that we work with, being on the go-to-market side of the business can sometimes be somewhat uncomfortable. It's not the most natural thing if you are used to spending a lot of your time on engineering. That being said, I think you really have to force yourself to do it. Again, about like reaching level of fidelity, right? Any barrier that you put between you and your customer, even if it seems like it's constructive, even if it seems like it's somebody else's zone of genius and not yours, there's going to be a translation element there that comes into play where you're not going to get the highest fidelity read on what exactly the customer is interested in and what exactly they want to be buying. And so early on, I think it's like basically non-negotiable that you as the founder have to be the one to interface with those end customers and build up those relationships. And early on too, a lot of your customers wind up being what we call design partners. And so they're oftentimes not paying you necessarily, but they're playing a very active role in the development of the product. They're usually willing to engage pretty heavily, be very hands-on, provide a lot of feedback. So they're spending a lot of time with you, even if they're not spending a lot of money. And the more you can build those relationships at the founder level, the more that will serve the company in the medium to longer term as you continue to build the business, because they'll be bought into you, bought into your success from a personal relationship perspective, as well as hopefully being users and ultimately paying users of the product that you've built. Once you're making that transition, so you say you've made your first few deals, you've signed them up, you've signed your first few design partners, whatever it winds up looking like. As you're heading into the Series A, you'll want to start thinking about how to make that handoff from founder-led sales to more of a classical sales team. So usually we'll see people bring on the first one or two SDRs. There's kind of varying wisdom around whether it makes sense to bring on one or two at the same time in case one of them doesn't work out, as they often do. But when you're making that transition, leading up to that, you really want to be thoughtful about codifying everything that you've kind of been doing over the past 6-9 months, however long it is that you've been running this founder-led sales playbook. There's always going to be a translation gap between you as a founder selling and what you're able to communicate to someone else. It's never going to be a completely perfect handoff, but the more you can do to document the conversations you've had, the touch points you feel like have resonated, common objections that you've had to handle and how you've addressed them, what you feel like works and doesn't work as it relates to navigating organizations, what you expect the holistic sales process to look like based on your experience, the more of that you can codify, the easier you are going to make someone else's life when they are trying to get ramped up on selling. And like I said, there's always going to be a gap early on. It may even make sense for a time for both the founder and the sales folks to sit in on conversations to try to smooth that over. But hopefully putting in place a real process will help mitigate that a bit. And then, of course, ultimately you're going to have to experiment. As I mentioned, at the beginning of the company, you're probably scanning the wide world of possibilities of customers you could sell to. Maybe you narrow down to one ICP, you run in that direction for a while, and then you realize it's not quite right. Don't be afraid to iterate and move into another direction if you feel like you don't have product market fit. We've certainly seen a number of companies in our portfolio that started out doing one thing and then are now doing something completely different. And the value that you bring as the founder in part is knowing when to say enough is enough and when to move in that different direction. And it's a really hard line to draw, but I think that you do have to be willing to iterate, experiment, and reposition if you feel like it's just not working. Okay, so on the fundraising side of things, there's actually, I think, no silver bullet for how to run a good fundraise in the absence of a business that is working. That, at the end of the day, is the thing. If you have a business that is resonating with your end customers, a product that people love, this early signs of product market fit, however you run the fundraising process, there might be some slight variability in the outcome, but it's not going to really matter. You're going to be able to get it done. There's a lot of optimization to do with that, sure. But from an existential perspective, if you've taken care of the business, the fundraise will take care of itself. And that is something that I think a lot of people miss. I think that sometimes people wind up trying to optimize like the story of their company for the fundraise. They think, oh, if I get to the magical $1 million ARR mark, then like I'll be all set. People will hear that and they'll jump on board. The reality is that's just not what's going to happen. There's a lot of depth there, which we can go into from a metrics perspective of what people will consider. And at the end of the day, what you have to be seeing is the early signs of repeatability and the early signs of product market fit. And you have to put in the work to get there for however long it takes. I've seen founders where they've been building the product to reach some level of critical feature parity with some alternative for legitimately 2, 3, 4 years. Especially on the infrastructure side of things, it's not uncommon at all for that to be the case. And when they have the patience to get the product to that place and to hold off and stay lean on any further fundraising until you've hit that point of resonance with customers, it can have amazing results. There's one company in particular I'm thinking of. I knew them for a long time since the seed round, and they just stayed so lean. They had a team of 5 or 6 people for easily 3 years. And then they reached a point with the product where customers were really like pulling it out of their hands. All of a sudden it took off from, I think what was like a couple $100K of ARR to something like 2 million of ARR. And like that was the right time for them to do the fundraise. And that's because they invested the work in making sure that the business was in a good place before they leaned into any sort of rapid expansion of the team. Following on from that, the right milestones for you might not be the right milestones for someone else. And I think it's important that you index more so on like, what is the repeatability that you're going to see in the business? And that can take a number of different forms. So on the SaaS side of things, you'll oftentimes want to lean into an enterprise sales motion, as I mentioned, that transition from founder-led sales to SDR or AE-led sales. And I would say that it's important to try to do that prior to your Series A, because that's where you start to get that sense of repeatability of if you took someone's, $10 million, $12 million, could you go out and hire another 3, 4, 5 SDRs or AEs and get similar results to what you had seen with those first couple? You can't really underrate that when you're doing founder-led sales, because the founder selling the product is going to have that extra level of magic, extra level of relationship, which is just not repeatable and not scalable because you are only one person and selling is just one of your many responsibilities. So I think in that instance, if you're a B2B SaaS product, it's less so about the 1 million ARR mark, and it's more so about, do I feel confident that if I onboarded another 2, 3, 4 enterprise sales folks, that they would be able to achieve similar results to what I've seen from my first couple salespeople so far? And do I feel like the results that those people are seeing are exciting enough that it merits investing in the business at this phase? That might mean a certain level of contract value. That might mean a certain quality of company that you're selling to. It's always going to be like a little bit bespoke to you, but generally speaking, I think it's more of that feeling of repeatability than it is any hard milestone. On the infrastructure side of things, it can be even tougher to calibrate because sometimes infrastructure companies don't have any revenue at the time that they raise the Series A. Sometimes people will underrate that on the basis of open source or community momentum, and it can just be an early signal around what is the quality of company that's using this open source product in production, and are there any comps that we can point to where a similar open source project has led to a similar result on the commercial side of things that seems exciting in the future. So it's always squishy and variable depending on the type of business. I know it's not like a satisfying answer as a founder, but that's the reality. And I think it's not important not to get hung up on like these fake, like clean, nice sounding benchmarks when that's just not the reality of how most of these processes work. Another thing that I think is important to pay attention to, which people don't always do, is to build your target list of investors relatively early. So I think probably the right time to do this is maybe a year or so out from your fundraise. I know that seems like super egregious, but I think that it can be really helpful. The same way I talked about hiring before, right? Getting a better sense of who your prospective investors are over a longer period of time will give you a much higher fidelity read on how they're likely to behave. And I've actually seen with companies in my portfolio that they're able to extract a good amount of value from getting to know investors over the course of these processes. So, whenever my companies are considering taking meetings with follow-on investors, I recommend that they ask for either hiring introductions, for potential customer introductions. Like investors who are really interested in you will follow up and will try to provide those things to you. And it's a good way for them to show you early on that they'll actually bring value to the table. It's also a good way for them to get degree to meet with you and spend the time together to build that relationship. And I think being really thoughtful about who the people are that you spend time with pays dividends, because then when you ultimately do get to the Series A process, you can have a really narrow set of folks that you would feel really good about being on the board. And you can constrain your time in that sense and avoid it being like a huge distraction to the business where you're spending weeks on end cold outreaching to new folks, getting referrals to new folks, and kind of throwing people haphazardly into the process. That's just not like an opt way to do things. And that's related to my last point. I think ideally, you're getting to a point where the business has that repeatability that we talked about. You're feeling good about the state of the team. You're feeling like you're going to want to pour fuel in the fire. And you've done the work to then build these relationships with investors over 6-9 month period, maybe even longer. When you decide that you want to pull the trigger on the Series A, you're able to do very targeted outreach to that group of 4 or 5 folks. Say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. I think we have the repeatability. Here's the early signs that make me think that. Would you be interested in doing something together? And I've seen that go really well for folks where they're able to close a Series A in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks in a lot of instances. Because when people feel like you have taken the time to build that relationship ahead of time, they've already decided that they're excited to back you, right? Like if they continue to spend cycles with you, they're not doing it to waste their time. They're doing it because they see a potential payoff in the form of being able to have a long-term relationship with you and invest in the company. And so there's a lot of benefit to be gained from doing that. And then you can close out the process very quickly and feel good about the universe of people that you've talked to so that you can know that you're making the optimal decision for your company at that point in time. Because at the Series A, these people are not just, passive investors who are kind of sitting in the background. In a lot of instances, they're going to become your first non-company member that's sitting on your board. And board members are harder to get rid of than wives or husbands. Like that's the reality. And so it's important to have that level of thought, to have put in that work ahead of time, and to feel really good about the person that you're bringing in, that they're going to support you whether things are going well or things are going poorly, and that they're going to be able to add meaningful value to the business. So that's the high level. I'm happy to chat with folks, answer any questions.